This is Tabletop Babble, and I'm Kenny. Hi. Today on the show, I talked with cartoonist Scott Kurtz, creator of webcomics PvP and Table Titans. Scott also created and portrayed the character Binwin Bronzebottom of Acquisitions Incorporated fame, which was a big deal for me in learning what D&D and role-playing games in general could be. Scott's been playing D&D since it's been a thing, and he spends basically every waking moment of his sentience thinking about storytelling. We sat down on June 11th and chatted about the history of role-playing, comics, and collaborative storytelling. Welcome, Scott Kurtz, to Tabletop Babble. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me. I love doing this stuff.
I have so many questions, so I really just want to dive into things. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is how you got into gaming. I know sort of the brief outline, just being a fan of your work, but I kind of want to talk to you about, as someone who's been in tabletop games for a long time in a lot of different ways, can you give me like a bird's eye total view of your history with games?
So I'm going to try to make this concise and remember, but try to understand it was quite a long time ago. And I have distinct memories. I'm not 100% sure of the order. But the way that I think is the correct timeline is that my father brought home basic Dungeons and Dragons. So in the 1980s, the Satanic Panic was a big deal. But equally as much a big deal was that D&D kind of blew up. And it wasn't just nerds playing it. A lot of people played it. My father and some of his buddies at work played it, and he worked at a construction company.
It was almost like a board game thing at first.
Yeah, I mean, like, I know there are different versions of the game. You know, my dad didn't bring home chainmail or anything. He brought home the second or third iteration. It was already the TSR company. I remember the blue box more than anything, with that kind of very stylized painting of the lady with the dragon. He had showed us his characters and showed us about the game, and it was me and him, and we were really, really into it. So I know that I, right off the bat, not only had permission from my parents to play D&D, but it was introduced to me. It was also a big deal at our school, and my oldest friend in the whole world, who I've known since the 5th grade, he and I met playing D&D during canceled recesses. So whenever we had an indoor recess in the 5th grade or any kind of book time, we would play kind of homebrew D&D over in the corner. And we then started exploring other role-playing games because there was a really cool store. I lived in West Des Moines, Iowa, and there was a cool store in downtown Des Moines, a little hole in the wall that was just a game store. And so that kind of introduced me to, there's more than just Dungeons and Dragons, that there are other games that you can get. And it was really exploding then. And as a cartoonist and someone who's super, super into comics and art, I wasn't just obsessed with the game. I was more obsessed with the artwork in the books. So I got to know and recognize all the names of the early Dungeons and Dragons contributors. So Dave Trampier, Jeff D., Bill Willingham, all those guys. Well, we go to this game store and we see an ad for a superhero role-playing game created by one of the D&D artists, Jeff D., and it was called Villains and Vigilantes. And it was made by, I think it was called Fantasy Press Games, and we lost our minds.
It was everything you wanted.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a D&D, but comic books. Like, we just couldn't believe it.
Just took everything you wanted and just smashed it together.
So here we are. We're kids about to start junior high, calling all these stores, Toys R Us, everything we could find, try to find this game. And we kept calling it Villains and Viliginites because we didn't know what vigilantes were. And then finally we found a store that happened. They go, "Do you mean Villains and Vigilantes?"
Sure.
And we're like, "Yeah, duh.
Of course, fools.
Of course." So, and then I went to visit my cousin who lived in California. So, I mean, I never really saw him very often. But when I got there, he's like, I gotta tell you all about this game we're playing. But he had found advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And I was like, what?
Not for beginners.
Right. It was the hardcover books. It was just like, I was like, I can't wait to get home and tell all my friends that there's a grown-up version of this too, not just the kids' version. So that went hand in hand with video games because I was a kid at the kind of advent of video games. So I was there for the very, very first video games. I was there for Pong and the first Atari and Space Invaders in the pizza place. And there was an explosion of personal computers in the mid-'80s. Yeah, early 80s.
I was just going to say, it feels like that particular time when you were growing up is a really interesting tipping point in games in general, where these things were coming into existence. Like, that's a time that is so unique and won't happen again. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The things that become the standards, the things that set the stage were happening right then. And you were growing up as they were.
Yeah, there's a really interesting book called Outliers. Have you read Outliers?
I have not. I know a lot of Malcolm Gladwell. I haven't read that one.
So if you ever heard anyone say, it takes 10,000 hours to be good at something, that came from that book. But one of the things Malcolm Gladwell talks about in Outliers is when you pick people who have done really crazy things, like if you take a Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, you can usually trace it back to them being at the right place at the right time to get that 10,000 hours before everybody else. And as I'm reading that book, because I'm a narcissist and I'm egocentric, I'm like, I wonder what because clearly I'm an outlier. I'm a pioneer in webcomics, and I wonder what's my thing, and what was my event. So like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs had access to computers way before anybody else through universities and stuff. So I'm sitting here reading the book in my own head, being a egomaniac, going, I wonder what my thing is. And so now that I just turned 50 this year, I was thinking about that book again, and actually it is that I have two kind of outlying tipping points. The first was I grew up in the 70s and the 80s at a time when my childhood was Star Wars, Spielberg, George Lucas, video games, Dungeons and Dragons, all happening at the same time. All these staples of pop culture happened right at the right time as I was growing up, ready to absorb them and excited about creating stuff myself. The movies I grew up with were all Spielberg and Lucas and all that stuff. And, the movie War Games came out and everyone started flipping out about whether or not computers were good for kids to be around. There were all these TV shows, like you'd be watching TV and the news would be like, tonight at 11, new report, are video games bad for kids? Is it bad for kids to play video games so much? And, what's happening in these arcades? And
or the satanic panic you already mentioned, same thing.
Right. The satanic panic happened because some bad kids made some bad choices and they happened to have D&D shit in their house.
But that's all of these things, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could have been, I think they had a lot of heavy metal in their stuff in their house too, but no, the church group wasn't going to take on the music industry, but they could take on probably TSR. It's weird and it's scary. I remember showing my dad, for comics, for him was Superman and Batman, and for me it was X-Men, right? So I was in the 80s when Claremont and Byrne were doing X-Men, and so it was Cyclops, Nightcrawler, Wolverine. It was the new X-Men, was Thunderbird and the Phoenix, and one of Marvel's very first graphic novels. I think it was the first time the term graphic novel was coined, was an X-Men book called God Loves, Man Kills. And it was so well written, and it was like, I remember thinking, well, it's a comic book, but it's as good as a real book, Dad. It's a graphic novel. This is like a novel, but they didn't just put the words in, they put pictures in too. And he's flipping through it, and he's like, I'm not interested in this. And I'm like, Dad, but look at this. It was Nightcrawler. And he's like, well, why is this guy so scary? Why is this guy got to be so scary? And I said, the whole point of the book is they're mutants and they were born different. And this guy looks like he was marked by the devil. And he goes, I don't want a superhero whose power is he was marked by the devil. And I said, no, he wasn't marked by the devil. He was just born this way. And I got really upset. I remember crying because my dad is a German immigrant. And I'm like, Kurt Wagner is a German immigrant. You should love this character the most. Like,
it's built for you.
I got to grow up when the first video game hit and the first graphic novel hit and the best adventure movies hit. And like, I don't know, man. Whenever I try to talk to young cartoonists about the genius of Peanuts, they all look at it like, there's nothing genius about
it's so
this.
blasé.
Right. And I'm like, yeah, but he was the first guy to say, I will make kids that talk like adults.
It's really interesting. I always love these kind of moments where you look at that first moment of genius, and one of the signs that it truly is genius is looking back at it, it looks completely boring and benign because it did something so fundamental.
I call it bullet time effect.
Yeah.
Matrix, I remember we saw The Matrix, and then right afterwards we saw the Phantom Menace. And on the way home, I was so upset, and I said to Angie, like, how can you screw up Star Wars so bad that the best movie of the year is not a new Star Wars movie? It's this little thing called The Matrix. Because I said, Angie, what was in that Star Wars movie? Star Wars. He had Star Wars. He owns Star Wars. And he could not make something more interesting than that movie that we had not heard about that we went to see on a whim. And she's like, nothing will be better than that movie. That movie blew my mind. And then 2 years later, The Matrix seemed dumb because everyone was doing bullet time. It was just like everyone was freeze framing and spinning around in midair. But now go back and watch The Matrix because it holds up. It's super, super good.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
It's interesting, those things that you go back to, what does and what doesn't hold up. I remember in college, I had never watched Citizen Kane, and I was told, oh man, this is genius. This is absolutely brilliant, completely revolutionized movies. And I watched it, and now I can appreciate it, but I still can't enjoy it because it really was doing things that you completely take for granted. And the reason you take it for granted is because they were doing it for the very first time.
Yeah. It's really interesting to me. I have this conversation all the time, and my friend from the 5th grade is actually coming next week to visit, so I'm sure we'll talk about it again because we're all grown now, and he's got kids of his own that are our age when we were hanging out. But back in the 80s, it was kind of like the Goonies. You had a group of friends, and your whole world was what you could reach on your bicycle. And your only rule when you said, Mom, I'm getting my bike, I'm going to go hang out with Rob, was be home by the lights coming on. Be home before the street lights come on. That was your only rule. And we would ride our bikes to the mall and just hang out at the mall. We hung out at Valley West Mall in West Des Moines, Iowa. And they had an arcade there. And my mom was always like, I'm really worried about you going into that arcade. And for those of you listening that don't know what an arcade is, imagine a Dave & Buster's, but cool.
But good.
So in the 80s, the best video games you could play were not console games or home games. They were arcade games. They were big, giant cabinets that had the new video games in them. And, you'd see them in all kinds of places. You'd see them at gas stations. You'd see them at movie theaters and at pizza places. There was one place where the whole store was nothing but a room full of those. They just lined them up. And it was just this cacophony of sound. Well, when you have a room full of monitors that are showing video games and you want that stuff to look good, you need to dim the lights. You need to dim the lights so the lights of the video games are brighter and more vivid. So an arcade was this very dark cave full of squawking video game cabinets, usually run by some creepy teenager with a mall job.
Sure.
And it was sketchy as heck. They were sketchy looking places.
It's a weird combo of like commercial but also arcane, like something magical about it calling out to you.
Yeah, for us, but for a parent looking at it, it's like
just danger zone.
Yeah, it's like the weird scene in Pinocchio with the with the fox inviting all the kids in and they come out donkeys. Like, Hey, Mom, we want to go into that place with really dark corners in it and that real sketchy guy in there.
Okay.
Yeah, but so that and then when personal computing exploded, kind of mid '80s as well. So IBM came out with the first like IBM PC, and then Atari did a bunch of PCs, and then there was an explosion of home software for those computers, and so D&D kind of bled into tabletop gaming, bled into that. We had games like Zork and the Ultima series. So we had tabletop RPGs and adventure gaming and text gaming bleed into computers. So I want to include that as well in my history because that was huge. The Zork adventure games, there was a company called Infocom, and they did all these text-based games, which now they're kind of popular again. They're kind of known as like visual novels are real popular right now. But they had all kinds of them. They had Zork was the most famous, and there was another one like thing called Planetfall, and there was another one where you were a worker inside of some kind of scientific laboratory that something bad had happened in. And then they started doing them for other properties. Like there was a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy
Really?
text game. Yeah, it was really funny. Yeah, all that stuff. That's all kind of gaming.
It's kind of interesting to me just how big a term RPG is, like how much
Yeah.
space it takes up, and such disparate but connected experiences fall under that umbrella.
Yeah, I have a whole group of friends who have a very nostalgic view towards JRPGs because they had PlayStations and I didn't.
Yeah.
And Final Fantasy existed only on the PlayStation. So, but it's the same thing, right? Like you build a party of, kind of different characters with different classes, and you enter a large open world, and then you start finding encounters, and then you take turns. It's a turn-based thing. Like that's Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
That's straight up Dungeons and Dragons. So, yeah, all that stuff.
It's interesting to me. I introduced in my general play group, I introduced D&D to the group. And this is, I went to college from 2006 to 2010 and then introduced my group to D&D who had never played it before, but they are video game people. And it was really funny hearing their experience when they would encounter things like Magic Missile, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, it's like this video game." And from my perspective, it's like completely reversed. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like when you show a kid Lord of the Rings, they're like, "This is Harry Potter," and you're like, "I'll kill you."
It goes back to that fundamental thing, right? Like Lord of the Rings feels very. I can imagine it feeling very rudimentary to someone.
They ripped this off from Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, or from anything.
Yeah.
Like it feels kind of basic. So this is getting me into the next kind of question that I want to ask you. So we're talking about the kinds of stories that you can tell and fundamental versus innovation. So something I feel like I noticed about you and your work, both at PvP, your work you did on Table Titans, you strike me in a lot of ways as kind of a traditionalist guy when it comes to storytelling. Like you feel very rooted in strong story structure, strong story beats.
Oh, wow. That makes me feel good.
Well, listen. I'm not done with the question yet. The second part of the question is, though, I also feel that you are very much into innovating and doing different things. Because in so many conversations I've listened to that you've had over the years, you talk about these sort of old school story beats, and you talk about the same thing, getting kind of blasé, getting kind of bored with them and wanting to push and do new different things. And so I was wondering, it's a big question, but I was wondering if you could just talk about what is that balance? Like, what is that, as someone who makes stories for a living, how do you strike a balance between telling traditional, like having structure, and doing something new?
I feel like my writing is very character based, and I also grew up with kind of an era of stories that involve grand gestures, whether that's adventure or drama or romance, and they're big moments in the movies, right? So like if I mention a movie, you probably think of the biggest moment in the movie, right? If it's that kind of a movie. So if I say Jerry Maguire, you probably think Show Me the Money. And if I say like A Few Good Men, you probably think You Can't Handle the Truth, right? There's big moments in the movie.
Like the iconic moment.
Right, the iconic moments. And I am a junkie for really good dialogue, really smart dialogue. And I also am a junkie for new ways to do things, or smart ways to do things. And someone recently brought up, I recently started talking to a therapist because my last 4 years have just been crazy. I became primary caregiver for my dad, then he ended up in a group home, and then the pandemic hit, and I turned 50, and I got all depressed about it, and so I was like, I'll talk to somebody. And one of the questions was, we were discussing work-life balance, and my wife laughed, and she said, you're never not working, you're never not writing. And I said, I don't know how to turn that off. And she said, we watch TV, and I'll watch TV with you or a movie with you, and something cool happens, and I'll be like, that's cool. But you say, oh, that's so smart. And it always, I go, I do? And she says, yeah. You'll pause the movie and point out to me why that was a smart piece of dialogue. And I go, yeah, I guess I do that. Tombstone, the movie Tombstone, there are very iconic moments in that too.
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. And I'm sure when I say Tombstone, a lot of quotes come to mind. But when someone says Tombstone to me, there's a moment where it's when, it's towards the end of the movie when they're chasing down the cowboys. There's already been the shootout at the OK Corral. Morgan's been killed. Virgil's been injured. And Doc is deep into tuberculosis. So they're at this kind of campsite, and they're all sitting around. Wyatt's off doing something. And Doc is just dying from tuberculosis. And this character, Cactus Jack, he says, Doc, what the hell are you doing out here, man? You should be home in bed. And Doc Holliday says, I'm here because Wyatt Earp is my friend. And Cactus Jack says, hell, I've got lots of friends. And Doc says, I don't.
Yeah.
There is so much exposition in that one line. What would have taken me 10 pages to I would have started writing a lot about their friendship, and how, the importance of their friendship and why. I mean, there's just so much in that moment, and it makes me want to rethink how I write.
Yeah. You were talking recently on Going On Forever about Schitt's Creek. And about one particular moment, and it's exactly the same thing that you're talking about now.
Where it's exactly the same thing.
There's so much packed so densely into...
To be able to write a line like that is... I don't think I've pulled it off yet. But yeah, in Schitt's Creek, the character of Moira Rose has a lot of wigs, and she's named them all, and they're gold to her. They're more important than gold. And she lets one of the characters wear her wigs, and she's named them all. I don't remember the name of the wig in the dialogue, but let's say it was Stella. And she says, I haven't let anyone wear Stella since David wanted to be Alanis Morissette. And that line killed me because it said so much. First of all, it said, this wig is very important to me, this item, and this is only the second time in years that I've let anyone use it. The first time was when my son, who we've seen in the show as an adult, was a child. So that conveys the importance of the item. And it conveys the importance of the gesture of her letting Stevie wear the wig. And then she says, since David wanted to be Alanis Morissette, not Alanis Morissette for Halloween, not for dress-up day, wanted to be Alanis Morissette. So her son wanted to be Alanis Morissette, and it was so important to her that he get to do that she let him wear one of her wigs. Probably just out and about. And it was, it's such a throwaway line. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, so many people probably missed that. And
it's one of those things, though, where it's like you may have not have noticed, but your brain did. It's good to be analyzing it on that level, especially if you want to be a creator. But even people who I think who aren't really examining that much still know more about the characters now.
Yeah, but what's funny is one of the great things about Schitt's Creek is that at no point in the show do they ever talk about love in any other way other than love is love. They never bring it up. It's almost as if in this world, no one ever thinks about it beyond that. So no one ever goes, when David and Patrick announce they're going to get married, no one goes, oh no, are you worried, that people are going to think bad things or anything like that? Or no one makes a joke like, we just watched Hacks and someone said to a gay character, when are you going to get married? Because I want to go to a gay wedding. I have a dress that's going to make all the straight people lose their minds. There's not even a joke like that.
Yeah.
Because in Schitt's Creek, there aren't gay weddings. They're just weddings.
Right.
And I noticed that too. And I said to Angie, that makes me want to change the way that I write. I just recently finished a script for a middle grade graphic novel that we're going to be pitching soon. In it, I kind of visit when I had to move away from Rob. I moved away from West Des Moines, Iowa, so I have the characters doing that. And it's a Table Titan story. It's about how they met. And in the story, Alan finds out Andrew's going to move away, and he's very, very upset. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to him. And Val, who's just met them, is finding out. She's sitting with Alan, and in this story, Val's the new kid. She just moved to the area. And so she's like, oh, no, yeah, you're going to move away. And he's like, he's going to move away forever, and we'll see each other in the summers, and we'll talk online, but it'll never be the same. And she's like, wow, you guys are really lucky. And he says, how are we lucky? And she says, well, I moved away, and no one even knew I was gone. And you guys are going to miss each other, and you're going to think about each other all the time, and you guys are going to be friends forever. And I left, and no one even knew. And then when she walks away, Alan says, if you moved away, I would miss you. And I was really, really proud of that line. I was really proud of writing that. And I'm like, this whole story, this whole script was just getting to that moment. But that, I don't even know if that's equal to the examples I gave. But I like writing that stuff. I really do feel that it's character-driven stuff that I like. And I'm very obsessed with friendship, too. It's very tropey to have characters fall for each other. And when you're watching a show, you're like, oh, are they getting a thing going? But I find it far more interesting when people just become friends.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, as a random example, I'm not a big fan of Star Wars Rogue One, but I do like that our two main characters don't fall for each other at the end.
Yeah.
They're just with each other at the end.
Yeah, there's something to be said. And I was thinking about my friend Rob, and I think it also has to do with the age of the people writing, maybe, because when you're younger, I think you're focused more on romantic love. It's what you're excited about, and it's new and it's exciting. And once you meet someone and you fall in love and you build a life together, that concept of love changes. I remember a friend of mine, when my friend Rob's parents got divorced, I asked my parents, are you ever going to get divorced? And my mom laughed. And she said, no, I'll kill him before I ever divorce him. I asked Dad, like, you've been married to Mom for a long time. Do you still love her? And he goes, no, not really. And I said, you don't love her? And he goes, no, that word's really not big enough anymore. She is me. We're the same. Like, she's half of me. Love doesn't really cover it anymore. And I said, I don't really understand what that means. He goes, you will. And now I'm 50 and I get it. And love to me now, even relationship love, like we talk about it in Going On Forever all the time. But my love for Angela, my wife, the depth of it is not that dissimilar to my love for Rob, my platonic love for Rob. I mean, absent of a physical, intimate relationship that obviously I don't share with Rob, that I do share with my wife. But as you get older, that even wanes a bit. It changes. So if you think about it from a purely emotional standing point, Rob was the first great love of my life. He was my best friend. We were obsessed with each other. I was devastated when I had to move away. I pined for him when I couldn't be around my best friend. And we did everything we could to remain friends forever. There was a period where we broke up. Like, if I were to describe the relationship to you without context, you would think it was an ex.
Yeah.
Girlfriend or boyfriend.
I think it's interesting. Like you're saying something that I have had my own personal theory about for a long time. You're saying it in a positive way, which is like the love becomes more encompassing. And my version of the same thing is I tend to think of romantic love as great deep friendship plus some kind of sex or sexual attraction or something physical.
I don't have a very broad experience with that. So I probably am talking out of my butt when it comes to this stuff. I was a very nerdy guy in growing up. I wasn't very confident. I didn't date a lot. I didn't have a lot of girlfriends, and I grew up with John Hughes movies, so I was more interested in falling in love. I also had a chemical imbalance, a hormonal imbalance, so I grew up without, my puberty was odd because I didn't have as much testosterone as the other guys, because my hypothalamus gland was broken, and I didn't find that out till my 30s. So I got to go through puberty and not be a complete jerk like all my friends. I didn't get really angry and mean and annoying, but I was way more into the emotional side of relationships than this hormonal physical drive to grab a booby.
It seems like that translates into your work too, where like the bonds between people, any kind of people, dictates what the story is.
Definitely. It's all relationship and character driven. And I grew up with sitcoms, and the concept of found family is a recurring theme in all of my work, which would make you think I did not have a good family life, but I did. I had a wonderful biological family.
So do you think that popped into your work because of the media influences you had, or is that from somewhere else?
I don't know. I'm sure that I could probably ask my therapist about it. I'm sure she would tell me that it comes from a deep-rooted desire to be liked. One of my problems is I'm too open of a book, so I meet someone and I like them, and then I go, you're my new best friend, call me every 5 minutes, and there's too quick of a race to intimacy with me that's caused me to get into problems, because what'll happen is that's not a healthy way to reach intimacy with anyone, an intimate relationship. And I mean intimate in the sense of a deeper relationship, not a sexual or romantic relationship.
Being close to someone.
Being close to somebody, right? So you can't rush that. That has to happen at its normal pace over time. There's a lot of hurt feelings when you rush it and that's not returned. Well, it's not possible for someone to return that so quickly. So, I had a friend stop me one time and say, you don't have to become everyone's best friend right away. You don't have to just give them the keys to the house. My therapist described it as the kitchen table, the front door, and the fence. And the kitchen table is, your intimate self. Well, if you just invite someone you don't know right away to the kitchen table, and then they turn out to be not who you thought, now you got an awkward situation because they're at your kitchen table, and you have no one to blame but yourself for that. But it doesn't make you a bad person to make them wait at the gate a little bit and then wait at the front door a little bit before they sit down at the table, which is also an interesting thing to explore in stories. One of the things that I really, really like to do is collect people. I collect comics. I collect all kinds of things, but I love collecting personalities, and I like collecting stories because they help me write interesting characters. The most interesting characters are flawed, in my opinion, even if that flaw is they're perfect and not flawed at all.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't gel very well in the real world all the time. And also that can bring its own problems, because if you're very talented and good looking and popular, then life isn't always necessarily great for you. So I like collecting that stuff. I like being at the back of a party and watching people and observing people. I always say that the biggest part of cartooning is observation, not an ability to draw. So yeah, that's what's really important to me. Is I don't know that we'll ever know what this whole life is about or what it's supposed to mean, but I think the closest that we can get to understanding it is that we're just here to love each other and take care of each other. I mean, honestly, and I think that the struggles that we have with that and the success we have with that to varying degrees are what makes the most interesting stories.
That got very big.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of stuff I try to write in between the fart jokes of PvP and Table Titans,
Hey Kenny.
Hey, Amber.
I have a question for you.
All right, shoot.
If you could pick any one Magic the Gathering card to eat, which card would that be?
Acorn Catapult, because I want those squirrel nuts.
Good answer. I'm surprised at how fast you did that. I don't know. Is that a real card?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I didn't know. Cool. I learned something.
There's all kinds of stuff that you can learn on Red Mage, Blue Mage, a Magic the Gathering talk show on the Geekspective Network.
If you're like me, an idiot who doesn't understand things, you can also learn from Kenny, who's great. We talk about Magic lore, how to actually play the game, what does a mana curve look like, and other cool stuff.
All that and more. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, and pretty much any major platform. And we're on Twitter at RedBlueMTG.
Check us out!
I was going to say, when it comes to Table Titans, to connect that back, one theme that I see sort of popping up again and again in the comic, which is about people sitting down at a table together, and then also their characters in the fictional world,
right,
and mixing between, is being the outsider, being the new person.
Yeah.
Like, there's very literal versions of that. Like, each arc seems to have, I am the new person sitting down for the first time with this group.
You want that in a story.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of stories, when it comes to the structure of it, you want one character that's the entry point character for the reader.
Yeah, to jump into the world.
Yeah, and D&D is kind of a complicated thing, and not a lot of people that don't play it understand what it is. So if you have a character that's like, what's this game? I don't understand it. The reader can go, neither do I. I'm excited to learn.
Yeah.
And you want that character to be compelling. In Table Titans, it was Darby.
Mm-hmm.
And Darby was just such a free spirit. He was originally, that character was the gag of Darby was he was going to be this annoying hipster.
Yeah, which is how he's designed.
Yeah, he came in and he was just going to be like, sweet, I'll be a druid. I actually self-forge myself, you know. And he was just going to be this annoying guy. But we did this one line where he goes, wow, you guys are really passionate about D&D. And that was kind of the way I had it in my head, was like Otto the bus driver, like, wow, you guys are really passionate about D&D.
Yeah.
People read it was, the way that people read
That's
it was,
amazing.
wow, you guys are really passionate about D&D. And we just got all this mail that was like,
that's how
I'm
read
Darby,
it.
I'm Darby, I'm Darby. And we went, uh-oh, wow, look at that. And then we just sat down one day and we were just talked about Darby for like 3 hours. Corey's like, he's 100% now the new character. He's just Pollyanna. And that led to that great line where there's a line where they go to that town and they're about to walk in and talk and they realize it's a murderous mob. And they're like, we got to get out of this town. And they're going to sacrifice a sheep or anything. And then Darby's like, they're going to kill a sheep? Like, we got to get out of here before they murder us. And Darby goes, oh, we got to save that sheep.
Which is something every group can relate to, I think.
Yeah.
My thought is connecting back to something we said earlier. You had those lines like in Schitt's Creek where it was like encapsulated thing that condensed everything down. And you're like, this is so smart. It's so masterfully crafted.
Right.
And you just related to me this line that Darby says that people reacted to so strongly.
Yeah.
So what percentage of the time, I mean, I'm not asking for a number. I'm more just thinking like, how often does it happen where you say, wow, that was so brilliant. And for the writer, it was like, I didn't even think that was a thing. That didn't.
I'm sure it happens all the time.
Yeah. Who knows what those lines are that are
No,
just so
who knows
perfect.
what their intent is. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, I think you can see it in art a lot too. I don't really talk about this a lot, but I tend to, I've been known to mentor other artists that will write me and I'm like, hey, here's my email, send me stuff. And when I'm mentoring and critiquing, I'll tell people, look, you got to redo this one part. You drew this very sloppily. And they're like, well, you do that kind of stuff too. And I said, yeah, but I do it by design. You didn't do it by design. You did it because you didn't know how to draw that part. And they're like, well, how'd you know that? And I'm like, because I've done that.
Yeah.
So that, I'm sure that I've called it wrong in the past, but sometimes you can tell when it's been crafted. And sometimes you can tell when it's a happy accident. And sometimes you just don't know. I mean, we get so many behind the scenes featurettes and stuff, and people on podcasts and all over social media, and sometimes you just get to ask the question and find out these little behind the scene things. But yeah, it's crazy how often that happens. I mean, in PvP alone, two of the most popular characters were, or two or three of them were just throwaway things because I didn't have an idea. Scratch was a throwaway idea, the Panda was a throwaway idea, and Lolbat was a throwaway idea that wasn't supposed to go past one strip, but people reacted to it.
And also, I think, funnily enough, if I'm remembering, you've talked about this, PvP as a whole was kind of that way too, right?
Yeah, the whole strip was throwaway. Yeah, I was approached to do the strip. I was approached to do a strip by a gaming website back in the late 90s, and they were putting up a new website to just be all about massively multiplayer role-playing online games. And they said they saw this. I was just posting little goofy comics, one-panel comics about Ultima Online in like the UO Stratix forums. And the guy that ran this news site saw them. And he's like, "You should do these comics for us, but do them, do a new comic for us." And then so PvP is what I put together. It was actually a comic I was submitting to syndicates about a school, about elementary school teachers. Then I converted it. So the principal became the editor-in-chief, and the art teacher became the art director, and the kids just became Francis and Marcy, and then I just threw in Skull, just for fun.
Just throw that in there.
Yeah, and instead of a school, it was a magazine.
Happy accidents. I think that's a good tie-in to role-playing games in general. I think for the game masters out there, the dungeon masters, some of the most memorable things fall into that category of done on a whim, and it just takes off with your players. I had a question in general, and maybe this is a good final thing to discuss before we wrap up here. As someone who is very interested in stories and is interested in observing people and observing how stories are structured, and someone who is into role-playing games, if you could give a piece of advice to the people out there of what's something that you could do to think more about story in the games that you run, do you have something that you could tell them?
Something I can tell people to do more about thinking about story.
In role-playing games.
In role-playing games. Like as a dungeon master?
Yeah, or as a game designer. But because I'm thinking, just maybe a little bit of background here. Looking at your work, you mentioned sitcoms. And the thing me personally, looking at stories, because I do the same thing where I try to dissect how people are writing something. The thing that stands out the most to me about your work are story beats. It's very, very intentional, I think.
Yeah.
I can see the beats being laid there, and they feel really good. And it makes me think about how I can adapt that to telling better stories.
Yeah, it's harder in D&D because the players will always go in the direction you don't expect them to go. Telling stories when I run a D&D game is very different from telling stories when I'm writing.
Right.
It's more similar to when I'm writing on a team, which is very, very different. I've only gotten to do that a couple times in my career. I've had people be on a writing team for periods of PvP. I've been on a writing team for a book we did called Truth, Justice, and the American Way. I've been on it for Table Titans, and I did a comic with Penny Arcade guys called The Trenches, and we were a writing team on that. And when you write as a team, you're bouncing ideas off each other, and it goes, this happens, then this happens. No, that does. No, that does. No, that does. Yes, that's what happens. And it's like, he's doing this. No, he's doing it like that. No, he's doing it like that. Yes, that's how it happens. So when you play Dungeons and Dragons, my attitude as a dungeon master is like filming an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm. There's not a script. There's an outline, and everyone's going to improv, and we're going to take the best take and say that is the script. So I always tell my players, look, you guys are writing the story. I'm just telling you what's canon. I'm just telling you, I'm like, think of me as George Lucas, and you guys are all writing books. And you come to me and you go, hey, I have an idea for a novel about an X-Wing pilot in Red Squadron, and he got blah, blah, blah. And I look at this and I go, yeah, I like that. That's canon. That exists in the same world as the movies. And then you're like, oh, it's canon. You know, when I write stories for my comics, I try to be as original as possible. When I write for D&D, I steal constantly. I steal from everything.
Yeah.
You know, I've taken my players through the movie Taken, and halfway through it, they're like, is this Taken? And then for the rest of the thing, one of the characters was just literally called, it went from being the name I wrote for him to the Liam Neeson character to just Liam Neeson. It was literally Liam Neeson. And we're all laughing. Krahulik used to do that too. Krahulik had us all playing a game. One time we realized it was Pokemon.
Yep.
And at one point we're like, this is Pokemon. And then he was like, yeah, it's Pokemon. I'm super into Pokemon right now. So you steal all the time. We did an improv D&D game where we did Mad Libs and on stage. And we came up with the best D&D story. And I actually put it in PvP. But what happened was they were approaching a house from different angles. The party kind of split up to like infiltrate this one house where the bad guy was in. And everyone went from different angles. Two went from the front. One guy wanted to investigate the chimney and from the back of the house. And then the other guy wanted to flank all the way around. And there was the guy that flanked, there was only one trail through the woods that he could find, and there was a big cow in the way. So he put the cow to sleep with the sleep spell, but botched it. And so it fell on him, and he was trapped into the cow. So then he cast grease to get out from under the cow. But it was on a hill, so what ended up happening is the cow slid down the hill, crashed into the guy by the chimney, busted through the chimney, and the magical grease caught on fire. And so the people out front were interrupted by this flaming cow bursting out the front of the shed and knocked them over. And then we decided, because it was magical grease, that the fire never went out, but it didn't really... Oh, yeah, then the cleric tried to heal the cow because they felt bad for the cow. And all the magic mixed poorly, and the cow was just now this flaming cow that was just endlessly on fire but not hurt. Like it was a cow fire elemental and just wandered off into the woods. And when the panel ended, I said, some claim they still see that flaming cow in the woods. And so we had people during the con screaming, long live Mucifer, because we had named the cow Mucifer. Now, I didn't sit down to write that story.
Sure.
And I never would have come to that story if I had sat down to write it. But my writing team, which at that point was all my players and an entire panel of guests, we wrote that story.
Yeah.
And it has structure, and it's a 3-act story.
Yeah.
Like it had real structure. So just give yourself that space.
I think it was kind of, it's born out of, from what you're saying, like, here's a problem, what's the solution?
Yeah, I mean, that's what storytelling is.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you set up a conflict and you resolve it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you gotta, when you're writing stories, you have to paint your characters into a corner. You have to paint yourself into a corner and then see if you can figure out how to get out of it.
What's the way out?
Yeah. And then when you figure that out, and a lot of times when you're writing, it's funny, Brian Hurt was doing breakdowns for me for the second book of Table Titans. And breakdowns are like quick thumbnails. So he would read the script and just kind of thumbnail out the page, like stick figures type stuff. And then I would come back and then I would draw the page based on his layouts. And he would say, hey, there are like 2 or 3 points in the script where just out of nowhere it just goes SSH. And I don't know what the SSH is. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, just, I don't know, like right here. And at this point just says SSH. And what it was when I'm writing a script, if I get stuck and I don't know what happens, but I know what happens after, I just write something stupid happens and that gets us to here. And then I go back and figure it out later because I don't want to stop my momentum. You know, I know they enter the place. I know they get to this one thing. I don't know how I get to the next place, but I know what happens from that point on, so I continue. But I put as a placeholder, something stupid happens, and then they get to here. Well, I abbreviated that to SSH, something stupid happens. But I guess I forgot to take out the SSH, or the find replace didn't work. So he found my vestigial SSHs. So, yeah,
and then
something stupid happens.
And then when you're working with other people or you're sitting down at the table, the SSH is what you throw to the players around you.
Yeah, I mean, honestly. Yeah, I mean, I think when you first start DMing and you're like, and they're like, you say, well, there's a chest and there's a faint glow coming from the chest. And you know what's going to happen when they open that chest. And that's what leads to the next part of the story. And they go, really? Describe the chest. You say, well, there's an eerie glow coming from what appears to be underneath it, and maybe even inside of it. And they go, wow, all right. We check out the closet. What? Well, you mentioned the closet. I did mention the closet. And the door won't open. No, it's old and it's... Like,
why won't it open?
Why won't it open? I don't know why it won't open. Yeah. Well, tell me about this lava. It's lava. You're in a volcano. Nah, I want to cast this on the lava. And you just go, oh, open the chest.
You do, but those are always the best stories. I think to do a quick story that one of our co-hosts, Amber, in her own campaign, she had a town guard, classic town guard, just like, welcome to town. Let me show you what you can see.
Yeah.
Her party got completely obsessed with this person, and they asked for a name. They always ask for names.
Yeah, I do.
And the one that she just pulled out of a bag was Mr. Becky Ann. And that was like, on the one hand, that was like the worst decision, because of course they're going to be interested, but this was also the best decision. And the entire next arc of the story became about Mr. Becky Ann's birthday party in town. And it became an entire fiasco. So I to distill a little bit, I love your advice of finding the best take and that quick, loose negotiation of what is the beat here and what works.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to run with it, You got to run with it, and you got to let them play. I mean, that's the whole reason they're there.
Absolutely.
And it's, I think the worry, I think the push to fight that is to go, oh, no, you have to go this way. I don't know what's in the closet. But you'll learn pretty quickly that your players are very, very forgiving. One of the things that, if you really want to make things easy on yourself, if you're a starting DM, is start the game by asking the players a question where they get to determine a part of the world. Because once you establish that, you can use that as a get out of jail free card a lot. So, because again, you're there to tell them, yes, that's correct. That is what's happening in this world right now. One of the things that we do, especially with level 1 characters, is we'll say, because level 1 characters, they really don't have anything to them. And so usually they've just left home or something like that. So one of the things I have to do is I say, listen, so you're an aspiring wizard, you've lived in this place, you've just left home, you're heading to Red Hawk. You brought one thing with you to make you feel safe. What did you bring with you? It doesn't have to be a weapon. It can be anything. And it was an idea that Corey, my business manager, had. And he was playing with a group of people, and one of them was the drummer for the band, the Decemberists.
Really?
And he said, yeah. And he says, I bring a boombox. And Corey goes, yeah, you did bring a boombox. And he kind of came up with like a medieval version of like a music box. And one guy said he brought a contract. And one person brought a lantern. And so, then once you establish that, once you go, well, I brought, a contract. You're like, yeah, only you know what that contract is. Well, now you've given the players agency to determine what's happening in this story. So when they say, when you tell them about the chest, they go, I open the closet. You can just say, all right, you break the closet open. What's in it?
I love that. It's kind of a different variation on the classic improv thing, which is yes and. And I like something that you said there where instead of yes and, it's just yes, that's correct. Like, yes, you're right. That is true about this world.
That is what it was. Right.
And then
I do that all the time.
You just give so much agency to them.
Yeah, and Corey's even experimented where no one has their character sheet filled in when they start. They know what they want to be. They don't have their stats filled in. So the first thing they encounter, they're like, you put them in front of something like, you're in the town and you see that someone screams, help, help, and a horse is, a donkey's running towards you and it's a runaway cart. And it's like, now, how do you want to deal with this? And if they go, well, I'm going to steal up and stop the donkey, or I'm going to dodge out of the way, you say, do you handle, is this the way you normally handle problems?
Yeah.
You try to dodge out of the way. All right, well, then put a 15 in your dexterity. And then by the end of the first night, they filled in their character sheet.
I love that too, because it's like, no matter how they answer, it's interesting. Is this how you normally handle it? Yes. You've told me something very clear about your character. No, but I am this time. That's interesting too.
Right. So through that, we ended up coming up with a whole class. A buddy of mine came up with the idea of a person who was a wizard, but all of her magic was handled through food. So everything was a food product. She was a cook. She was a goromancer. So we were just constantly converting spells into a food item. We had sriracha spray, and we had, sleepy time tea, and we had all these different spells. And then we came up with a whole system where after they killed a monster, they could make a skill check. And if they succeeded, they could remove a gland or an item that they could turn into a potion to help them get towards their next spells. So, yeah, and then because that was an interesting kind of idea for a character, was a wizard who's not making potions, they're making food.
I like it too, because it turns it back to the rest of the group as you are having fun thinking about what is the food version of X spell.
Yeah, everyone gets involved. Right. Yeah, I'm telling you. That's what's fun about those games.
Yeah, turning it back towards each other. And like you said...
Yeah, and growing up, I didn't really have... Well, we were all kids, so you can't blame anybody. But I didn't have DMs like that, and I would just annoy all the kids that were DMs because I would get bored immediately, especially if they were too into the rules. And I would be over in the corner drawing characters and drawing comics about my characters. I just wanted to know more about their story.
It's so funny now because I think about people in junior high or high school coming into the game and how much more accepted it is to play role-playing games, B, just the vast trove of resources they have to learn and improve. But, that makes me think the same thing. When I was learning to play, I've talked about this on a previous episode where Amber was interviewing me, but I learned to play and learned to be a game master listening to the Ack Inc. podcasts once upon a time.
Yeah.
And
that was the whole point of that ad.
Yeah. And it worked. I love the idea. As much as I'm envious of people right now coming into the hobby and all that they have, I am in love with the idea that as we progress further and further, people will be more and more enriched, and we'll all look back and be embarrassed that we had so little to work with when it comes to telling stories and playing games together.
I'm sure it's the bane of Hasbro's existence, but it's a real boon for us players. But there are so many expressions of that game. You have the people who to them it's really an exploration of the rule set. You have the people that it's purely telling stories. You have the people that it's like Critical Role is performance. It's a bunch of guys and gals in LA doing a stage show.
Yeah.
And meanwhile you have Hasbro, a company whose job is to exploit IP, and they're normally like My Little Pony, a bunch of characters to exploit. G.I. Joe, Transformers, tons of characters to exploit. Dungeons and Dragons, no one cares about any character except the one they're playing, and you don't own it.
Here's a game where you can make as many characters as you want.
Yeah, here's a game where you can make as many characters as you want, and the company owns none of them.
And the more successful you are, the more you empower players to make the game themselves.
Yeah, I had an ex-Wizard employee tell me that one time, this is the best review I ever got on any of my stuff. And I won an Eisner, so keep that in mind. Was apparently a Hasbro employee came in and threw a copy of Table Titans down on the table, and they were talking about Table Titans and Critical Role, and he says, how is it that these are the most popular expressions of our IP, and we don't own it? And I was like, oh my God.
Just a little fist clinch.
I need to put that on a plaque
as you walk
put it
out
in
the
front
door.
of my Eisner. Yeah.
That is incredible.
It was pretty cool. Pretty cool to hear that. I don't know if it's true, but I'm going to pretend it's true.
But I accept it as reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Scott, thank you so much. I'm not going to eat up much more of your time. I really appreciate you sitting down.
No problem, Kenneth. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun. I love talking about this stuff. So,
before you go, do you want to shout out current projects where people can find you?
yeah. So, my daily comic strip, pvponline.com. That's where you can read PvP. It's been going for 23 years now. Also, if you'd like to read the previous 4 years of Table Titans, you can go to tabletitans.com. I have more Table Titans on the way. It might be in a different form than a webcomic. I'm trying to break into mainstream publishing, and just recently got a literary agent, and we're going to be pitching a middle grade Table Titans book soon. So
I was very excited to hear Whispers.
yeah, I'm stoked. I'm really, really pumped about the potential of that. And also, check out our podcast. I have 2 podcasts. One is about creativity and living the creative life. It's called Surviving Creativity. And the other one is a relationship podcast that my wife and I make called Going On Forever. And you can find those on Spotify. You can find them on Apple Podcasts and stuff. So please check those out. And if you like them, tell a friend about them.
I would recommend. I came to know your work through your podcast. And since I first listened, I was like, wonder if I'll ever get to talk to Scott Kurtz one day. So
yeah, all you got to do is ask.
Well, thanks so much, Scott.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. You can find me on Twitter at RocketOrca, Kenny as at Volfmere, and John is at Crossways GM. Tabletop Babble is part of the Geekspective Network. Go to geekspective.com to check out all our other shows or follow us on Twitter at Geekspective. Our theme music was provided by the Battle Bards.